Thank you again, Xing Xia, for being with us today. As a short introduction for everyone, Xing Xia, if I pronounce your name correctly, is an assistant professor of economics at Yale and US College and an affiliate of ALSET as well. She is actually an applied microeconomist, and her primary research focus is on human capital, education, health, and the labor market. Our current research project involved studying the relation between the labor market and the higher education market and how they actually influence each other. She also studies how natural disasters affect human capital accumulation in Southeast Asia. Xing Xia has a great background with a BA in economics and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Wuhan University and a PhD in economics from Columbia University. Xing Xia, thanks again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Alex. So I'm an economist, and this is more or less of an economics talk. I know most of you here are probably not familiar with economics talks, but I would welcome questions and interruptions at any time during the talk, and that would also help me understand if there's anything that the audience may not be familiar with about this research. So in this research, we look at how students choose their majors within the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at NUS. And in particular, we look at how the letter grades we give to students affect their choices of majors. So the choice of majors has been a question of great interest to multiple social science disciplines. And partly that's because for students, this is a very important personal decision. It affects what careers they take in the future. It affects their earnings. And we know as a matter of fact that choosing an engineering major, for example, would give students a much higher earnings than many other majors out there. It also affects their lifetime well-being. So this is a very important question from students' perspective, but also from the perspective of entire economies and governments. The choice of majors affects who goes into what industries and what occupations, and in that way, it affects the functioning of the economy as a whole. So very often, policymakers would love to understand how students choose majors in order to be able to design policies, such as how do we nudge students towards certain majors where there's a shortage in the labor market. So in order to design all these policies, the first thing that we need to understand is how do students choose their majors in the first place? What are the factors that affects their choices? And then by understanding that, we can then design policies that help them or nudge them towards certain choices that we want them to make. Okay. So in the economics literature, usually we list 3 general factors as affecting students' choices. The first thing, of course, is their interests and their preferences. You know, some students might have a strong interest for studying history, and they would love to major in history no matter what else is happening in the world. And that's a strong factor affecting their choices. But more than that, increasingly, we're understanding that students are also very affected by their preferences for the future careers and occupations that they want to go into. So some students might have a strong preference for going into the nursing industry or the teaching industry, and they choose a major according to what they might want to do in the future. And then last of all, which is the point that is very important for us, is for economists, we think of students as thinking about their earning potentials from each major, that when they're choosing between 2 majors that they're equally interested in, it is very often the future earnings that has a big role to play in their major choices. So the research question that we are focusing on in this project is, how do the letter grades that we give to students in their introductory choices affect the students' majors? Do they have any effects at all? And if they do, why is it the case? You know, what mechanism is driving their choices in those ways? And to be specific, we as economists are very interested in the causal effect of letter grades on students' choices of major. So what do I mean by the causal effect? Okay, so what I mean is that Naturally, if we just look at the data, there's going to be a very strong correlation between grades and their choices, because the students with very high grades are naturally going to be more likely to choose the majors. And that's because there are going to be a lot of confounding factors that affects both their major choices and the grades they obtain in a certain class. So for example, one strong factor might be efforts, and efforts is usually a result of interest. So for example, if I'm a student who's very interested in history, I'm going to pay a lot more effort in my intro to history classes than my other classes, because that's what I want to focus on. And then naturally, as a result of my interest, it's more likely that I will have better grades in my history classes than the other classes. So if we just look at the correlation between students' grades in different disciplines and their eventual choices, there's going to be a positive correlation, but that correlation does not tell us what is the causal effect of letter grades on students' choices. So ideally, in order to get to this causal effect, what we would love to do is to run a random experiment, randomly assign two students that are very similar to each other in terms of preferences, interests, and their academic abilities. We can randomly assign them two different grades, give one of them an A and the other one a B. And then maybe we follow them up to observe what are their choices 4 years down the road in terms of what their major choices are. Well, this kind of experiment would give us the ideal answer to this question, but it's not going to be possible to run that experiment in any university, and it's also going to be unethical for the students to do this to them. So in this project, we employ an empirical strategy that is very popular in economics right now, which is a regression discontinuity design. Okay, what this means is, thankfully, in the NUS data, we observe both the students' letter grades, the A, B, C, Ds, and the underlying numerical score that the instructor has assigned them. So we know the exact performance they have in the class, as well as their letter grades. And I'll just use this rough example to illustrate what we do. So basically what we do here in the regression discontinuity design is we look at every introductory class and we rank students by their score in their class, the raw score they get. And we also observe their grades, which is much more noisy than the raw score. What we do is we compare students that are very close to the cutoff. So here we see the cutoff between A- and B+. And we see that there are a lot of students who, this is a hypothetical example, but in NUS, most classes actually look like this, that there are a lot of students whose actual numerical scores are very close to the cutoff. And what this means is that these students close to the cutoff, they are the ones with very similar performance in this class. And in the NUS context, students do not observe their numerical score. The only thing they observe is their letter grades. So we think of these students as being very similar to each other in terms of preferences, motivation, and their mastering of the content of this class. The only thing that differs is some of them get a little bit luckier and they're just happens to be above the letter grades cutoffs, and some of them are not as lucky and they just happen to be below the cutoffs. So what we do is we compare the students who are right above the cutoffs and the students who are right below the cutoffs. And the idea is the grades they receive is as good as randomly assigned, because it's a matter of luck if they're 0.1% above the cutoff or 0.1% below the cutoff. And then we compare their choices down the road to see, do their major choices differ 3 or 4 years down the road when we observe their actual choices? So this is the idea we have. We use a regression discontinuity design to compare students who are just above versus just below a letter grade cutoff. The advantages of doing this is we can almost non-experimentally, but almost as randomly as we can to control for their preferences, their efforts, and what they have learned in that class. So the specific setting we're looking at is the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at NUS. So some of you might be familiar with the context, some of you may not. FASS at NUS used to be the only faculty within NUS where students do not have to declare major when they enter the university. So FASS students, they apply to FASS as an entire faculty, and they don't actually write down anything about their major choices when they apply to NUS, and they're admitted into FASS. And as a matter of fact, FASS actually encourages students to take introductory courses in multiple disciplines. There's a requirement that all students have to take intro classes in at least 3 different disciplines before they declare a major. So as a default setting, students are forced to experiment in different classes, to get to know different majors and have a taste of all what those majors are like. Okay, and like I mentioned before, students only observe their letter grades. Other than the letter grades, they don't have a clear idea of how they're doing in the class relative to their classmates. Okay, so this gives us a perfect setting to use this regression discontinuity design to study the effects of grades in introductory classes on their later life choices in terms of their majors. Okay, so as a preview of our findings, what we find here is for students, FASS students who take intro classes in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, we find that being just above a letter grade cutoff in one introductory course leads to a 1.56 percentage points higher probability of majoring in the field where this introductory courses is from. So the idea is if I get a slightly higher grade, just above a cutoff in my intro to sociology class, then I am 1.56 percentage points more likely to major in sociology compared to the other fields that I might be interested in. Now, this number might seem very tiny, but we're looking at students who have already taken an introductory class in this field. So these are comparing similar students who have already chosen to take an intro class. They're already interested in this discipline. And this is the tiny difference. This is the difference that is the results from a tiny difference in their grades. So we're looking at the difference between A- and B+, right? In terms of the final GPA, this is only going to be 0.5 in 1 out of 40 or 80 classes they take during their university lifetime. So even though this number itself is tiny, but given the context of how small the grades differences actually are, and this being one of many classes students take, we think of this effect as being actually very big. Okay, I think there's a question in the chat room. But students' choice and what major students get allocated to may be different things. These are only so many places. Ah, I see. Yes, yeah. Thank you for that question, Lakshmi. As I understand the context of FASS, that students do have a lot of freedom to choose their majors, that basically they take introductory classes and then they can choose any major based on their interest. I am not aware of students within FASS where they're interested in economics, and because there's not enough slots in economics, that they're turned away. So yes, in other contexts, I know that the capacity, the number of students a major could take in is a constraint on what major choices they take, but that does not seem to be the case here in FASS. It seems that as long as these students can get into FASS, their choice of major is entirely a free choice for them.
Thank you, Xing Xia. That's a very important clarification. I'm just looking at whether you had the data on the student choices, not what the students finally went into, but you have clarified that if everybody wants economics and everybody is good, they can get into economics kind of thing, for example.
Yeah.
If my understanding is right. So I have to understand that. But yeah, I was just curious about students' choices versus what they actually get into, because in engineering, where I come from, that's a very common thing. My choice may be different, but what I'm getting into may be different, even though the mark gap can be smaller. Thank you. Please continue. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, so that's a very valid question. So I am aware of, sometimes it might be difficult for students to get into an intro class. So they might be interested in economics, but the intro to economics class is fully subscribed and they cannot subscribe for that class. And that may be happening to some extent, but we're controlling for students who have already secured a slot in the economics classes, right? We're just looking at they get randomly assigned some different grades. Do these grades affect their choices down the road? So I think we're looking one layer beyond that. These are students who already got into the classes. But thank you for that comment. We should look more into that if the capacity constraints actually affect their choices. Okay, so we find that there's quite an effect here of the letter grades on students' choices. And moreover, we find that there's quite big differences across different fields. So for example, within FASS, economics, political science, and sociology are the three majors where the effects of a letter grade on their final choices are very big, whereas other disciplines like Chinese and English, the effects of an intro class on their choices of majoring in that major is much smaller. Okay, and we find a correlation between the effects of a letter grade and the income GPA gradient within that major. Okay, what we mean is that in majors such as economics and sociology, where the final income when student graduates is highly correlated with the GPA they receive at the end of university, those are the fields where students are particularly sensitive to what grades they get. Okay. And we think this research has important implications. So we built an economics model and we map the findings to the economics model. And basically these findings support a model where students at the beginning of their university are not sure about their major specific ability. So they might be interested in multiple majors, but they're not sure how well they will do within each major because they don't know their particular fit and ability for each major. And that knowledge about this major specific ability is very important for their choices because students actually care about their earnings once they major in that major. Okay, so what grades do in this process of choosing a major is that grades is an important and in some cases the only kind of feedback that students can get on their academic performance and their strength within each major. So when we give students a slightly higher grade, they perceive that as themselves being much better within economics than other students who are in the class. So students view these grades as a strong signal of what their major specific ability is. Okay, and because of that, students choose their majors according to what grades they get in introductory classes, because they see that as a potential signal of how well they might do in that major. And this mechanism is particularly important for majors where the GPA matters a lot for them when they look for a job. Right. So the idea here is that there are some majors like economics and sociology where students are more likely to enter occupations that care a lot about their academic performance and reward them according to their GPA. And there are also other majors such as, maybe English literature and social work, where the social skills and other dimensions of skills might be more important in the labor market performance than their academic performance. So in those fields, their GPA doesn't matter as much in terms of their final income, and students are not as sensitive to their grades in those fields. Okay, so let me jump into the actual data and the results that we're getting. For the sake of time, I'm not going to describe the data in great detail. So basically, we use these great amount of data that NUS has made available to us researchers to study these outcomes. And we actually pull together more than 9 years of courses. So we use 9 years of introductory courses within the Faculty of Arts and Social Science. We look at all the introductory courses that are either required for the students to major in the major or are regularly offered for each major. Okay, so the total number of courses that we have in level 1 courses of FASS is around 360. We have around 600 level 2 or 2000 level courses. Okay, so someone asked, may I know what is the implication of 1.56 percentage points? Hopefully I'll have time to get to that at the end of this presentation when I relate that to other findings. Okay, so if you please, we'll hold on that question for a moment. Okay, so the average class size at FASS is almost 200 students per class, which is a very important fact for us because we're comparing students who are right above and right below that each cutoff. And this tells me that, the instructors don't have much room to place cutoffs where the gaps are very big. So it could give us more assurance that students who are just above and just below cutoffs are very similar to each other. In terms of the majors and the fields of study, there are 13 different fields of study within FASS, and these are the list of fields that we have in the data. Okay, so let me jump into the correlation. Okay, so this is a picture showing the raw correlation in the data between the grades that students get, or the average GPA in introductory classes. So we define introductory classes as 1,000 and 2,000 level classes. On this axis, we see the average grades they get in introductory classes. And on this axis is the average probability of students to major in that field, given the grades they have. So we see here that economics, for example, are in general have a higher probability of students majoring in economics, no matter what grades they are. And that's just a matter of fact that economics is a popular major within arts and social science, that at each level of grades, students are more likely to major in economics than others. Political science and sociology, as well as most other social science majors, are also very popular. We also see that for each majors here, there is a positive correlation between the grades they get and their major choices, the choice to major in that field. And like I said at the beginning, these correlations could just be a result of interest and their abilities, because if I'm interested in sociology, for example, I will work very hard towards the courses there, and I'm more likely to have better grades, as well as to major in sociology. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to our RD design. Now, I know most of you are not economists, so I intentionally skipped a lot of the details about what exactly is this methods, but let me try to use 1 minute to explain what we do here. So this regression discontinuity design method, essentially what we do is we're looking at all the cutoffs. So this is the average cutoff between two letter grades, and we convert their numerical grades into a distance to the nearest cutoff that they have. Okay, so this could be the difference between A- and B+ for students who are getting an A- and very close to the cutoffs. So we measure the distance from each student's numerical score to the nearest cutoff. And we look at the relationship between these distance and their final probability of majoring in that field. Okay, what this graph shows is that, on the left of these cutoffs, on average, students who take 1 intro classes, they are around 44% likely to major in that field if they have taken an introductory course. Now, the jump here shows us that the students who are just above the cutoff are much more likely than the students who are just below the cutoff to eventually major in that field. And this difference between the 2 points here is the regression discontinuity estimates that we're looking for, okay? So in this one, the outcome we're looking at is major in that field of study. And on this one, we're looking at is the number of 3,000 and 4,000 courses that students take in that field. Okay, so on the x-axis, we have distance to the cutoff in the introductory courses, say this is sociology, okay? Then the outcome variable we have would be the number of 3,000 and 4,000 courses the students takes within sociology, eventually during their university career. So we see here that, again, if we just look at number of courses they take, there is a jump at the cutoff. And this is the RD effects that we think are the exogenous effects of getting a slightly higher grade on students' course choices. Okay, so these pictures illustrate what our methods are, and then I'm going to move on to very packed tables that unpacks the different effects that we see when we look at different outcomes as well as different fields of study. Okay, so each of these numbers that we're presenting here is basically, what are the difference between this point and this point here when we look at different subsamples and different outcomes. Okay, so here in panel A, we have as outcome variable the probability to major in the field where this introductory course is. Okay, and we see that on average, there's this 1.56 percentage points effect that we see. This is almost a 4% increase from the mean of a 43 to 44% probability of majoring in that major. And then we see that the effects are much bigger in economics, in political science, and in sociology. And in that, compared to other fields within social science, has a very small effect. Most fields within humanities, such as Chinese, history, English, have very small effects on their major choices. And these effects are very consistent when we look at different outcomes that might reflect their eventual choices. So in the second panel, we look at not only their major, but also the second major and the probability to minor in the different fields. And the letter grades they get in introductory courses has an effect on all of them. In the last panel here, we look at the number of 3,000 and 4,000 level classes they take, and we see that again, the effects of a higher letter grade is higher in economics, is higher in political science and sociology compared to the other majors. Okay. So these are the main effects we have. The next thing we have is we also look at, do grades in one field affect their choices to major in another field? Okay, so back then, all these ideas here is that we're looking at the grades in one field, let's say sociology, and the outcome here would be the probability to major within sociology. The next thing we do is we try to look at, is there any effect across different majors? For example, if I get a better grade in sociology, that's what this number tells us, how does that affect my probability to major in psychology or social work? Okay, that's what we look at here. And we find that for most majors that we're not listing here, there's no cross-major effect. So in economics, for example, getting a better grades in economics improves my probability to major in economics, but it has almost no effect on any of the other majors. But there are all these three majors that seem to affect each other quite a lot. So there's sociology, psychology, and social work. And we see that having a better grades in sociology increases the probability of majoring within sociology by 3.35 percentage points. It lowers the probability of majoring in psychology by around 2 percentage points. Okay, similarly, if we look at what are the effects of having a better grade in intro psychology classes, we see that, there's some effect. It's not statistically significant, but there's around a 2 percentage points effect in majoring in psychology. But more importantly, it actually lowers the probability to major in sociology and social work by almost 2 percentage points as well. Now, in social work, this is a special case where having a better grades in social work actually lowers the probability of majoring within social work, and it increases the probability to major in sociology. So what do these mean to us? So Alex asked, is the effect of letter grades of RD? Yes, correct. So all these estimates that we're presenting from now on are regression discontinuity estimates. It's the difference between students just above and just below, and we interpret these as causal effects of having a better letter grade. Okay, so how do we interpret these results? Basically, as economists, we think about majors as, places and companies that compete for employees and students. Okay, and what these results tell us is that basically sociology and psychology, these are two majors where there's a large portion of students who are similarly interested in both of them. And these students actually are debating between majoring in one or another, depending on their letter grades. So I think these negative coefficients here are a sign that these are two majors that are very similar to each other, and they're equally competitive and attractive to students, and they're competing with each other for the same set of students. Okay. Now in social work, this one is positive, that having a higher grade in social work actually improves the chances of majoring in sociology. The interpretation that we have here is that it could be these two majors, they have very similar course content, they lead to similar career paths, but students view one of them as being a better choice overall than the other, possibly because their earnings in sociology are just higher from social work on average. Okay. So that's how we see here. But for most of the other fields that we are studying, economics, political science, and the other fields, for example, we do not find any effect of better letter grades on majoring in other fields. Okay, so that's the main findings that we have. Yet, yes, we do see an effect of letter grades. It's higher in some fields than others, and there are some competitive effects across fields in some disciplines. Now, how do we understand these results? How do we interpret them? And what are the reasons why we might see an effect in some fields, but not others? Okay, so we're building a very simple model based on the economic theories that we have on how students choose their majors. And the idea here is that students choose their majors based on both their preferences and the potential occupations and industries these majors could lead to, as well as the potential earnings they could get from each major. And how do students form an expectation about what their earnings or income might be within each major? Basically, students, they're smart and they understand that GPA matters when it comes to income. So they would form their expectations of income as a function of the potential GPA they will get within each major, okay? And the problem is, at the beginning of college, it's difficult for them to form an expectation about the GPA, okay? So before taking an actual course in political science, for example, students may find it difficult to predict what their future GPA will be in political science. What grades in introductory courses do is it gives them a indication of what their future GPA might be. So if I get an A in my intro to political science class, then I'm expecting that in the future, most likely, if I major in political science, I am more likely to get an A in that major. So that's what the role of grades do in this process of forming expectations and informing choices. Okay, now, why is it the case that students on different sides of the cutoff have different choices? And that's a natural result of their expectations of their GPA. If I am receiving an A- in my intro class versus a B+, okay, then A- would give me an expectation of my future GPA as an A-. Okay, so the students who are just above the cutoff, because of these differences in expectations, they're more likely to major in that major just because they think they will have a higher GPA eventually, and that makes them have a higher expectations of their earnings as well. Okay, so this is why the GPA matters. Now, why is it the case that GPA in some fields, the letter grades in some fields have a bigger effect than letter grades in other fields? So we think it's mostly because this function between GPA and income, there's a different gradient for each field. So in some fields, for example, economics and political science, these usually leads to careers in finance or government policy, where the jobs and the companies care a lot about their academic performance. So in those fields, their GPA matters a lot for their future earnings, and students are going to be more sensitive to their expectations of GPA, which means they'll be more sensitive to the grades they get in introductory courses. Okay, so that's the first dimension of a testable prediction or a hypothesis that we can actually use to test this theory, is that the theory predicts majors where you see a higher gradient between GPA and income are also going to be the majors where students are more sensitive to the grades they get in introductory classes. Now, the second prediction of this theory is that this theory is based on the understanding that students have limited information about how good they are in each major and each field before they enter university. But, some of them, maybe they were lucky, then have gone to a JC that provides courses in economics or history. So they may have had some exposure to economics and history before they came into university, and they have a better expectation of what their future GPA or their capabilities would be in those majors. Okay, so the second predictions we have is that this sensitivity that students have to grades would be correlated to what they studied before they came into university. Now, in the context of Singapore, this is important because most of our students, they came from JCs in Singapore and they took A-level classes. And this is something I only learned recently, is that A-level classes in Singapore are unlike what's offered in most Western countries, is that some majors like economics, geography, history, English, and Chinese. These courses are offered in junior colleges, and economics in particular are very popular among junior college students. Geography, I think as well, that a lot of students who are interested in geography, they had a chance to take them in JC before they came into university. But there are other disciplines such as political science, sociology, psychology, and philosophy. Now, especially the first three, these are very big majors within social science. There's no course in JC that teach these concepts and these ideas in these disciplines. So most JC students would have very limited understanding of what they might learn in political science and how well they might do in political science. So we're going to test this theory to see, is it the case that, you know, when we're looking at this set of courses that students had no exposure to before university, we see a higher sensitivity compared to the set of courses where students may have had some exposure to before university. Okay. So let me show you the results of testing these two hypotheses. The first one here is we're just looking at the income-GPA gradient. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip the slide. This is basically the results of this test. Is we're looking at, are the regression discontinuity coefficients, which is the effect of a better letter grades, is this correlated with the income-GPA gradient in each field? And we see, yes, there's a it's a positive and statistically significant correlation that fields such as poli-sci, economics, and sociology are the fields where GPA matters a lot for their income in the labor market. And these are also the fields where students are much more sensitive to the grades they get in introductory courses. Okay, so there's a question. The two variables in the model are interesting. High GPA in the more competitive major could be difficult owing to grading on the curve. Yes. Yes. I see. So yes. So there's a big fish in the pond versus small fish in the large pond case. Yes. Yes. Okay. So in some sense, this problem of, you know, some classes might be more popular in the sense that, you know, getting a better grades in economics is more difficult than in philosophy, for example. And that might be the case in a lot of schools. In liberal arts colleges in the US, for example, students, they are swayed away from especially economics and chemistry, because these are majors where classes are difficult. It's very difficult to get an A in those courses. In many ways, because of the context of NUS, these problems are actually much less of a problem in FASS than other contexts, because students are required to take introductory classes in 3 different fields. And in data that I'm not showing you, we actually observe that the average students who take economics classes in terms of their university admissions test score, they're not higher than the other majors. If anything, economics on average, they attract students whose university admission scores are lower than the other majors. Okay, so it's not the case that the average student in an economics class has higher abilities in general than psychology. So we're quite confident that because of the context that NUS is in, students are required to take classes. There is a curve in economics, but equally speaking, there's a curve in every major. So in some ways, it's not easy to get an A in any major. And that's less of a problem in this context, which help us in this standing. That I think what we are understanding here as the RD coefficient is the causal effect of a better letter grades, and that effect is, you know, that we can actually compare the effects across different disciplines, because every discipline has a curve, and the average ability of students who take intro classes in different fields are quite similar. Okay. So that's my response to that question. Okay, coming back to this test. Okay, we do see that, yes, it is the case that students are more sensitive to fields where income matters, GPA matters more for their income eventually when they graduate. So that's the first test. The second one is we test whether potential exposure to these majors before university affect the sensitivity they are to these courses. So the way we test here is we're breaking down these fields into whether the field was offered in JC and whether the field was not offered in JC. So here we have economics, political science, history, English, Chinese, and geography, these majors where they have some experience to before. And then here's political science, psychology, these other fields they don't know about before. We also break these effects down by looking at 1,000 level classes versus 2,000 level classes. And the idea here is that, even though economics was taught in JC, it is pitched at a level that is more similar to the 1,000 level intro to economics classes. And whatever they teach in JC is still much easier and different from the 2,000 level classes. And I think that's the case for most disciplines, that even if they're taught in JC, they're taught at this 1,000 level, and they're not taught at the 2,000 level. Okay. So we see that if we look at all fields in FASS, the effects of 1,000 level classes are bigger than 2,000 level classes, which fits into our theory, because this is the first chance that the students get to experience this class. So the information value of a higher grade in the first class is much higher in terms of affecting their choices than the 2,000 level classes. Okay, but we do see a difference that for those fields that are offered in JC, these are economics and geography, for example, we see that there is a stronger effect for the 2,000 level classes. Okay, and these effects, they're not statistically different from each other, but in terms of the size of the effect, it is higher for the 2,000 level classes than the 1,000 level classes. And we think it's because these 1,000 level classes, they had them in JC, they know what to expect, and that's not affecting their choices. Whereas the 2,000 level classes, they're very different from what they were offered in JC. And these are the effects of new information to the students. Okay, comparatively speaking, if we look at, this set of courses that were not offered in JC, these are political science and psychology. Okay, we see that the effects are much bigger for the 1,000 level class, because these are the first chance that the students has ever had to have a taste in that discipline. And the grades there send a much stronger signal to what they might, how well they might perform in the future. Okay, so those are the two major tests. I'm gonna skip this. Now, some of you might be wondering, what would happen if we're in a context like the Faculty of Science and the Faculty of Engineering until very recently, where students are admitted into a major and they cannot choose a major afterwards. They cannot change majors even if their grades in Intro to Chemistry is terrible. What would happen to those contexts? Okay, so there was a previous paper, which is an excellent paper that uses the same empirical strategy that we have here. And they focus on all of NUS, and most of their results are actually from science, engineering, and computing, these majors where students cannot change their choices and everything is decided before they came into university. So what happens there is, if students cannot choose a major, the theory this paper had was that if students cannot choose a major, grades are still important, and they send a signal to the students about their ability. What this does is students are going to change their effort because they cannot change their choices. They will still change their effort within those majors. And those efforts are going to affect how many classes, difficult classes in the 3,000 and 4,000 levels they take within that major. Okay, so the idea is, by receiving a better letter grades in my Intro to Chemistry class, I will be more likely to think of myself as being good in chemistry, and that gives me incentive to study harder and take more difficult classes, which might eventually affect my choice. What this paper finds is that, having a better letter grades in science, engineering, and computing within NUS has a very big effect on the number of upper level, the 4,000 and 3,000 level classes students take. Okay, and it has a big effect on students' eventual income as well, potentially because taking difficult classes are rewarded in the labor market. So the students who work harder and take more difficult classes, they eventually have higher income as well. There's a tiny effect on GPA, so this one is very small, even though in the paper it was statistically significant. And most of the change in income that they found was a result of the change in effort and the change in the 3,000 and 4,000 classes students take. So, okay, now what about our context? This is what happens if a student cannot choose a major. In our context, students who are allowed to choose a major, okay, we're still interested in this case, you know, they change their choices of major in response to a better or worse letter grades, but does it still affect their eventual effort in their university career? Does it affect their eventual GPA and their income? What we find is that, you know, there is a null effect. So within FASS students, possibly because they are allowed to change their majors, we do not see any effect in the total number of 3,000 and 4,000 classes they take eventually. Now, to be specific, we do see an increase in the 3,000 and 4,000 classes within the same field. It's just that students are reallocating their efforts from one field to another, and the total effect on all classes they take in any field becomes 0. In other words, if I have a better grades in economics, intro to economics, that would induce me to take fewer classes in other majors, in other fields, and more classes in economics. And the overall effect on the total number of difficult classes I take within my university career becomes 0. Okay, we also find no effects on GPA, and we find no effects on income, except for sociology. Okay, so for most fields, because students are allowed to choose a major, we do not see a big impact on their eventual income. And if we take these two papers together, I think they actually speak very well to each other. And basically, both of them are good evidence for this theory we have that students, they make choices about their majors based on the potential earnings they could have in the labor market. And at the beginning of university career, students have very limited understanding and knowledge about their major specific ability. So grades offer a very strong signal to students in terms of what their eventual GPA might be and how well they will do for each major, okay? When students are not allowed to choose majors, like in the other paper, they change their efforts. They become more encouraged to take difficult classes if they get good grades. When students are allowed to choose majors, like in our context, a better grades gives them a better expectation for that field, and they're more likely to major in that field. Now, finally, we do not find any differences in the effects across gender lines or across different students' abilities. We do not find much difference across low-income versus high-income students. One thing that we are trying to do is we're trying to see if we can find a good measure of how good their math is before university and how strong their preferences for each of these disciplines were before they entered university. And we want to understand, you know, for students who are very keen on studying psychology before they came into university, is it the case that grades don't matter to them anymore, or are they still sensitive? But we haven't been able to find a very good measure of pre-university preferences. So if any of you are working on this data and would like to have a better idea, please let us know. Okay, so yes, okay, so I think there was a previous question as to how do we interpret the size of the effect we're seeing here. I didn't put these in the slides, but there's a couple of research projects in the US that uses very similar identification strategy. One of them looks at AP classes, so advanced placement classes American students take in their high school and the effects of those on their final choices. And I think in terms of the size of the effect, we actually find quite comparable effects for the social science majors. What they find is that in the US, students are very sensitive to grades they take in economics, in government, which is political science, in psychology, but they're not sensitive to other fields like chemistry or math or English literature. So I think the general mechanism here actually works in multiple different contexts, that in some fields, students are more sensitive, possibly because of the occupations and the industries they eventually lead to. Now, what do these mean in terms of policy making? Okay, so the general conclusions we have here is that students, they use letter grades as a strong signal of their academic performance in this field. And these signals are very important because students at the beginning of college have very limited information about their fit and their abilities for different majors. And the policy implication here is that it is very important for us as educators and policymakers to provide as much information to students as we can about, their potential academic performance for each major, about the different career choices and occupations different majors can lead to, because these information really matters a lot in the process of choosing their majors. Okay, so I think my time is up. So I'll open up the floor to more questions.
Thank you very much, Xing Xia. This is a very fascinating presentation. Indeed, we have a few questions in the panel, and maybe you want to address them. There was one, so I think you might have addressed it partly, but one about how it may have some variation between students within the same letter grade. The one who did manage to get an A just at the very margin compared to those who had it by a large one?
Yeah, so I think if I understand that question correctly, the top performers in B+, so that would be, like, let's say this student here is the top performer in B and the bottom performer in B-. Do they make different choices? No, we don't have any causal understanding of that, because there's no way we can design a strategy to understand causally what happens. But correlation wise, this is what the correlation looks like in the data, that in some cases, like if we look at, so these are students who are between C+ and B-. If you look at these students here, it is the case that the better they perform, the more likely they major in that major. But as the general grades get higher, the averages, the differences become much smaller. But these are all correlations, so we don't have much causal understanding.
And there was this other chart where you had this these trends after the cutoff.
Yes, that's a good point. So
yes,
we have this here, and we do see that overall the trends are pretty flat. There's a little bit of trend. If you look at the coefficient here, it is negative. And this one is negative. The trends are flat, but these are very close to the cutoff. We didn't do this for the entire segment. And we do see that if we plot the same picture for different fields and different disciplines, the slope can be quite different in different fields and at different cutoffs. Right? And that's all I can say about this. There's a different question of by low income versus high income. Did you infer it using financial status? Yes, that's what we did, because we don't observe students' income. The only variable we have in the data that can be used as an indication of their income status is whether students received any financial aid during their university career, and we do not find differences in the effects across those students. There's another question about grades as noisy signals versus one that helps students to be circumspective of their strength areas to improve, not in the one subject, but as a collective, right? How can students benefit from more feedback beyond just the one final summative purposed grade? Right, is this the current conversation in the mainstream, general education? Would this be relevant in FASs too? From my limited understanding of the policy making process in this, I think there's a lot of variation in university policies in what kind of feedback universities provide to students. My understanding is that in most universities, instructors are encouraged to provide as detailed feedback as possible. So at where I teach, Yale and US, for example, we're encouraged to tell students how well they're doing, like every week along the line. So we give feedback on every problem set, on every project, and they know very clearly at the end of the semester what their numerical scores are, as well as what their letter grades are. So I think that's the norm in a lot of smaller schools. And I understand at a bigger university like NUS, the decision to not provide detailed feedback like numerical score, but only give students the letter grades is more of an administrative decision in order to prevent students from complaining about their grades or asking too much for better grades. So my understanding would be that it would still be possible for policymakers to try to provide more detailed feedback It's just that, you know, the conversation is not there yet, and we have very limited understanding about what will be the optimum form of feedback and how detailed should the feedback be.
Xing Xia, if I may add to what you said,
Yeah.
as you know, in NUS also, yes, you're right. The class size is much larger than residential colleges or a system like Yale NUS, but it is a mandatory thing for all courses to have a very high level of continuous assessment. That is what I wrote as CA. And these scores are registered in our Luminous system, which is our learning management system, in the grade book.
Yeah.
So the numbers are given, the feedback is given for individual students. There are places where the TA or teacher can go and type these things in. And sometimes the feedback is given in many layers. For example, as soon as an assignment is over or as an assessment is over, we feedback to the entire class saying this is the kind of issues and this problem and all that. So
right.
Students immediately know how to compare their responses with a model response, right? And the model goes with a disclaimer saying it's not a prescribed answer, but it is a way of looking at it.
Right. And
then, individually, students are given feedback as well. And the usual thing is about 60% is CA and 40% goes into the final exam.
Right.
The final exam marks are not shared with the students, but so they know out of 60 how much they've got.
Yeah.
And they also know the final grade. So there are a few things that are not shared with students, but that percentage has become very, very small over the years. So we are progressing in the reasonable direction.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for providing that. Yes. That's very helpful for our understanding. One thing that I would want to emphasize here is that, from the student's perspective, it might be the case that what matters for them more is their relative ranking within a big class of 100 students. Telling them you did well in this midterm is different from telling them, you are ranked 1 out of 200. And this is a very competitive environment that we're in Singapore, right? The GPA matters a lot for their income, and their ranking relative to their classmates matters a lot more to their income. So I think the expectations they're forming, they take a lot more into the letter grades, because in their head, that is what tells them where I am in this big pond. Am I a small fish? Am I at the top of the class or the bottom of the class? And that sort of ranking might be more salient to them, right?
Yeah, a couple of things. You're absolutely right. But as a teacher at NUS, right, I have to walk the line carefully, because the system is actually competitive, so we don't want to give the ratings so much. Right. So that students become very competitive and some, not good learning practices happen. Yeah. But what we do is, as the learning management system, I know Yale NUS has Canvas. I think your learning management system is different from ours. But in our learning management system, we indicate the average scores, the standard deviations that is made available to students. So you're right. They do not know their exact position, but they know where they stand relative to the average, relative to the standard deviation and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so partly the other thing, I think what the literature refers to and emphasize a lot more is more guidance as to what kind of careers their majors can lead to, and more opportunities for early internships, so they can get a sense of what my income might be if I choose to major in psychology versus sociology.
Yeah. So on that point, right, just one small sentence. It is very difficult to engage students. As a teacher, I found that students don't want to talk to you, don't want to ask you these questions. Yeah. They're quite transactional in their approach. They would ask whether this will come for the test or how is that equation solved, those kinds of things. Right. But we have had this mentoring programs at least in our department, Faculty of Engineering. We have tried it a few times and we have abandoned it. So we don't have a formal mentoring thing, though we wish students make use of it. But I don't know what really guides them. So we can do better on that from the student side as well as from the faculty side.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I have a question, Josh Gooley here. First, thanks for making your topic so accessible. I don't have a background in economics at all, but I feel like I had a good handle on everything you talked about. Okay. So I'm interested in actually, what should we do with this information that letter grades influence students' major choices? Because I can see on one hand, maybe this is a good thing, right? Because they're actually putting themselves in a better position in terms of earning potential. Right. But then on the other hand, maybe they're not following their core interests. We don't really know. So what I want to know from you is whether or not you think this is an effect that we should enhance or eliminate.
Yeah, so ideally, from an economist's point of view, this regression discontinuity is an effect that we want to eliminate. And the reason is because, if you look at this graph here, the effects we're finding is the tiny difference, the big difference between two very similar students who are very similar to each other. And ideally, in the perfect world, that is information asymmetry that we want to eliminate, which is these students, they're very similar to each other in terms of how well they did. And we want them to make choices knowing that, they're very close to the cutoff. They did, for the students who are just below the cutoff, we would want them to know, they're very close to the cutoff. They actually did pretty well, much better than they thought they were, or the grades reflect, right? So in this way, this is inefficiency in the economy, in the sense that, similar students are making different choices out of random reasons.
So does that mean we should just eliminate letter grades or grades entirely? Like, what's the...
Yeah, if it's up to me, I think maybe we should just provide the percentage scores. Yeah, but unfortunately, we are in the labor market or an entire environment where higher education just give letter grades, right? And, in some cases, people advocate for letter grades because they think that reduces the anxiety of students. But from this point of view of the feedback, the more detailed and accurate the feedback is, the better it actually is.
Thank you for your insights.
That would be my response. Yeah.
I think one of the things that some universities do, right, is they give the total final score as a numerical value and also give the letter grade, and the letter grade can be used for grade point calculations, etc. I've seen some universities adopt that. I don't know if that will help, but that could be interesting.
Right. Yeah, that would be my recommendation, is that from this point of view, that might be a better policy than the letter grades policy. Yeah, but there might be other considerations that policymakers have. Yeah. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this input from the audience as well. Thank you, Xing Xia. Indeed, as George said, you managed to make us believe that we could understand economics. Thank you very much. And this is opening some more perspective and new angle on these issues of grades for students, how to provide relevant feedback for them as well. Yeah. Thank you very much. And we'll give you a warm round of electronic applause for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here and for the comments that you've made. They're very helpful. Thank you.